Just 7 minutes ago, the gates of Buckingham Palace unleashed a revelation that shattered royal illusions, an official release confirming that Meghan Markle fabricated key claims about her royal bloodline ties. It wasn't just a press briefing, it was a calculated strike, decades in the making. But why now? And what explosive truths lie beneath the polished words of the palace's carefully crafted statement? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The world had barely begun to process the breaking news when phones across royal correspondence desks began buzzing in sync. A terse communiqué stamped with the palace's crimson crest landed with precision, and within seconds, headlines began to ignite like wildfire. The core of the statement was simple but deadly. Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, had knowingly made false claims regarding her ancestry, specifically those linking her to noble British lineage. But this wasn't a clarification, it was an accusation, cloaked in regal formality. The statement referred explicitly to persistent inaccuracies and a conscious misrepresentation of ancestral ties to the British crown. These were not the palace's usual euphemisms. This was an attack. Inside royal circles, the timing of this release was no accident. With Charles preparing to shift key ceremonial responsibilities to Prince William, and tensions between the royal core and the Sussexes reaching an unmanageable pitch, this revelation landed with the force of a well-timed explosion. For months, the atmosphere behind palace walls had been growing thick with unease. The briefings had become more guarded, the glances more loaded. What the public didn't know until now was that a dossier had been quietly growing behind the scenes, detailing inconsistencies in Meghan's background claims, especially her repeated references to ancestral British ties dating back centuries. The very idea of such a connection had been a key narrative thread in several of her interviews, even subtly hinted at in a handful of polished magazine profiles. Now the palace was cutting that thread with surgical precision. The language used was deliberate, almost surgical, designed not just to correct, but to humiliate. Terms like fabricated heritage and intentionally misleading claims weren't legalistic hedges. They were daggers, driven with full force into the public record. And within minutes of the release, social media erupted. Hashtags like #RoyalDeception and #MeghanExposed began trending globally. Pundits scrambled for airtime. Allies turned suddenly silent. Even staunch supporters appeared frozen, unsure how to navigate this avalanche of institutional force. This wasn't just a clarification, it was a declaration of war. BRB. Even in the chaos, a deeper unease began to take root because no one at the palace, not even the statement itself, explained how they knew. What had they uncovered? What evidence was so damning, so irrefutable, that the institution known for its decades of silence and composure chose to break protocol and strike in broad daylight? Whispers of a sealed file, of something long buried in the American archives, began to circulate, and behind closed doors more than one royal aide was said to be visibly shaken, because this was not an isolated correction. It was retaliation. And retaliation always has roots. BRB. Behind this 7-minute announcement lies a much darker web, one that stretches from secret DNA tests to a forbidden American file buried deep in royal archives. ARL-NG. Before tiaras and royal walkabouts, Meghan's past was already under scrutiny. But few knew the palace had been quietly collecting a sealed file from the United States, a document so explosive it was locked in a restricted royal vault. That file now forms the basis of the palace's case, a falsified bloodline Meghan thought no one would ever uncover. Years before Meghan ever stepped into the royal spotlight, whispers about her ancestry had already started circulating within certain aristocratic circles. What began as minor curiosity, sparked by Meghan's early remarks alluding to distant British colonial ties, soon escalated into a quietly sanctioned investigation. The turning point came when she began implying connections to a dormant noble branch that had supposedly intertwined with British legacy during the 18th century. Those subtle suggestions, dropped into public interviews and private conversations, might have seemed harmless if not for the increasing frequency and timing. And someone took notice. Princess Anne, known for her unflinching commitment to heritage, quietly reached out to a private firm specializing in forensic genealogy. Her instructions were clear: verify everything. What they uncovered set off alarms. Buried within American birth records was a trail of inconsistencies. Names that didn't match, records that had been retroactively edited, a great-grandparent who, it turned out, had no documentation prior to a 1940 census appearance under a different surname. The pieces didn't align, and worse, someone had tried to make them. At the center of it all was a constructed lineage built around a largely forgotten historical figure, a British naval attaché who had reportedly fathered illegitimate children during his time A.B. Road. Meghan's supposed link to him had never been publicly confirmed, but insiders say it had been quietly used in royal introductions, forming the emotional backbone of her case for inclusion. But that emotional appeal was about to unravel. The file, compiled over 2 years, was quietly placed into a restricted section of the Windsor archives. It contained not only the genealogical findings, but also email correspondence, media excerpts, and private testimonies from historians who had reviewed the supposed lineage. Most damning of all was the handwritten note from a former royal archivist who had been pressured to validate documents tied to Meghan's claimed ancestry. He refused. Weeks later, he left his post without public explanation, but not before sending a sealed report to Clarence House. That report remained unopened until the week Queen Elizabeth passed. It was during the chaotic days following Her Majesty's death that a critical leak occurred. A disgruntled aide, furious at being sidelined during succession planning, exposed the existence of the file to a foreign tabloid, triggering a media scramble that forced Charles to act. With the monarchy's foundation already shaken, the king authorized the review and release of key findings. The statement that followed was devastating. But the sealed file, the one that had quietly grown in the shadows for years, was the match that lit the inferno. Yet the file was only half the story. The real betrayal began when Meghan allegedly tried to weave this lie into the very fabric of the monarchy. It wasn't enough to marry into royalty. Meghan needed the world to believe she was born for the throne. With carefully chosen soundbites and covert media manipulation, she painted herself not just as a duchess, but as a long-lost royal descendant. But when palace historians reviewed her timeline, the inconsistencies were staggering. From the very beginning, Meghan's ascent wasn't merely about love or duty, it was about identity. Not content with being simply the American actress who married a prince, she began to craft a broader, more mysterious origin. In interviews, she spoke of ancestral ties to Britain, hinting at a bloodline that had somehow remained obscured, noble yet forgotten. These weren't accidental remarks. Phrases like, "I feel like this has always been part of who I am, and there's a deep thread of British history in my roots," were repeated, polished, and delivered with just enough ambiguity to let the public draw their own conclusions. And the media took the bait. British tabloids began running features titled Meghan's Royal Lineage and The Lost Heir Through America, giving credence to an idea that had never been verified, only suggested. Behind closed doors, the monarchy watched uneasily as the narrative grew legs. Then came the strategic pushes for inclusion. According to internal sources, Meghan's team made subtle but persistent efforts to have her image featured in royal exhibitions, celebrate generations of royal women. Staff overseeing those events were reportedly pressured to treat her not as a newcomer, but as someone reuniting with a legacy that had always been hers. The implication wasn't direct, but it was powerful. Suddenly, Meghan wasn't just a modern duchess. She was a missing piece of royal heritage, and for an institution that built its very foundation on bloodline purity, that was dangerous. It was Princess Anne who was first to raise alarm. Privately, she voiced concern that this growing narrative was not just misleading, it was corrosive. She saw a threat not only to the historical record, but to the legacy of her mother, Queen Elizabeth II. If Meghan's claims went unchallenged, the public perception of lineage could shift, distorting the fragile hierarchy that the monarchy had spent centuries defending. Anne wasn't alone. A growing number of senior courtiers began to compile press clippings, track interviews, and create a timeline of statements. What emerged was a carefully constructed pattern, an effort to suggest, without ever having to prove, and yet, despite the rising tension, the palace did not move publicly. There were no denials, no statements, no clarifications. Because within the House of Windsor, silence is strategy. They weren't going to confront Meghan with accusations. They were building a case in silence, and at the centre of it was an unlikely player, Prince William. As the monarchy faced growing public division, Prince William chose silence until he didn't. Behind closed doors, he orchestrated one of the most detailed verification campaigns in royal history. His goal wasn't revenge, it was preservation. What he uncovered changed everything. For months, William had watched with quiet intensity as a narrative unfolded that he knew, instinctively, could threaten the very foundations of the crown. The talk of ancestral threads and noble bloodlines wasn't just media noise anymore, it was shaping public perception. And with that came danger. But William didn't lash out, he observed. And then, in a series of discreet evening sessions at Clarence House, he initiated a royal inquiry cloaked in absolute secrecy. It began with the Royal Genealogical Society, an institution older than most titles in the peerage, summoned for a task unlike any they'd encountered before: confirm or debunk a duchess's claim to royal descent. What followed was months of painstaking cross-referencing, centuries of documents pulled from the deepest royal vaults, and tense meetings behind heavily guarded doors. When the lineage papers originally submitted by Meghan were quietly re-examined, several key discrepancies stood out: names misattributed, dates out of alignment, and family connections that simply didn't exist. And yet, the most critical revelations didn't come from the archivists. They came from someone closer to home. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had taken a particular interest in the claims due to her own immersion in royal story. One evening, poring through private letters passed down by Princess Alexandra's descendants, she uncovered a set of correspondences that flatly contradicted Meghan's supposed link to the long-defunct noble family. The timing was unmistakable, and so was the motive. Catherine's quiet diligence had unearthed the missing keystone, and it made William's next steps inevitable. The confrontation with King Charles was said to have lasted nearly 2 hours. William laid everything out: the records, the inconsistencies, the subtle manipulation of public trust. He didn't demand immediate action, he never needed to. His father could see the storm ahead, but what shook Charles most wasn't the evidence. It was the look in William's eyes. The burden had taken a toll, and at Sandringham just days later, William broke down in private. For all his discipline and duty, this deception had pierced something deeper: an assault on the legacy he'd sworn to protect. And yet, William wasn't guided by vengeance. He understood the cost of rashness. Instead, he helped devise a strategy to time the reveal carefully. It would align with a broader royal transition, a changing of roles and symbols that would provide the perfect backdrop for a quiet but decisive correction. The plan was ruthless in its precision, but dignified in its intent. Until Meghan struck back. Because while the palace was building a case, she was crafting a counter-narrative of her own, one that involved suppressing witnesses and rewriting history in her image. Princess Anne has always been the monarchy's enforcer. But when she discovered the extent of the falsehoods surrounding Meghan's claimed heritage, she took matters into her own hands, reviving a royal committee not seen since the days of Edward VIII's abdication scandal. For Anne, duty was never symbolic. It was visceral. She had spent decades defending the institution from within, navigating the crown's crises with a steel spine and a sharp sense of when to act. But this was different. The fabricated bloodline, the manipulated documents, the calculated insertion of Meghan into a lineage that never existed. These weren't simply inaccuracies, they were offences against history, and Anne, the last remaining daughter of the Queen, made it her mission to hold the line. Quietly, she reassembled a small group of legacy experts, archivists, and advisors, some of whom had worked on delicate matters during the Diana years, tasking them with one goal: verify every shred of Meghan's genealogical claims and expose any trace of deception. Her pursuit was relentless. She personally visited ancient estate archives across Scotland and the English countryside, chasing down estate letters and family registries that spanned centuries. She sat with historians known for their discretion, cross-examining old accounts and questioning inconsistencies that others had been too afraid to probe. In the process, Anne began connecting dots that had previously been dismissed as irrelevant, odd similarities in media statements, recycled surnames that appeared in unrelated branches, and a worrying trend of vanishing source records. The more she uncovered, the more enraged she became. But it was the confrontation at Balmoral that marked the turning point. In a closed-door meeting with Harry, one so tightly guarded that even senior staff were kept out, Anne confronted him with what she had discovered. Sources say her voice never rose, but her words cut deeper than any royal reprimand in recent memory. She laid out the pattern of manipulation, the quiet suppression of contradictory evidence, and the insult it posed not only to the family, but to their late mother. Harry didn't respond. His silence, some said, was confirmation enough. Anne didn't stop there. That same week, she penned a private letter to King Charles, urging an immediate public correction. Her language was firm but emotional. She invoked their mother's name, not as a shield but as a sword, reminding Charles that Queen Elizabeth II had dedicated her life to protecting the moral authority of the crown. Letting this lie stand would betray everything she built. The final weight came from the Queen Mother's own diaries, where she had once written that truth, once bent for favour, will collapse the throne faster than fire. Anne included a copy of that entry in her letter, underlining it in red. Her argument couldn't be ignored, not because she was loud, but because she was right, and Charles knew it. And just when it seemed like the storm had reached its peak, the final blow came not from the palace, but from an ancient royal oath, and a DNA test no one was supposed to authorize, buried within Queen Elizabeth. The second's private letters was a chilling clause. If a future royal's legitimacy was ever in question, DNA testing was authorized, but only by unanimous consent of the senior royals. When that test was finally used, the results did more than confirm the palace's suspicions. They unearthed something far worse. The clause had never been spoken aloud, not even in the most private family councils. It was penned in the Queen's own hand, locked away with instructions that it was only to be accessed if the integrity of the royal bloodline itself came under threat. It was not designed as a weapon, but as a safeguard, one last line of defense to protect the crown from deception, chaos, or scandal too deep to silence. After the revelations uncovered by Anne and the verification campaign driven by William, the senior royals met in a closed-door gathering at Windsor to confront what no one wanted to say aloud. The only way forward was through biological truth. Reluctantly, Prince Edward agreed to break the seal, and with his consent, the test was authorized. But from the moment whispers of the test reached Meghan's team, the response was explosive. Legal threats were immediate and furious. Her lawyers filed multiple injunctions in both the UK and US, arguing that any such test will constitute gross invasion and was based on what they called defamatory conspiracy. But it was too late. The monarchy had already moved with clinical precision. A private laboratory in Switzerland, one with no official ties to the crown, was selected. Samples had already been collected quietly and legally. There would be no stopping it now. When the results returned, they carried more than confirmation. They carried destruction. The analysis revealed no genetic tie to the House of Stuart or any recognized royal line through the branches Meghan had previously alluded to. Worse, several claimed ancestors had DNA markers that placed them far outside the European lineages referenced in her narrative. The final comparison came not from Meghan's side, but from Princess Diana's confirmed genetic profile. The palace needed to rule out any possible crossover or convergence. There was none. The report was brief but final. It stated unequivocally that Meghan's ancestry bore no verifiable connection to any established royal bloodline in the Windsor archives. For the palace, this was no longer a matter of dignity, it was a matter of record. But even as the royals braced to make their findings public, preparing for global fallout and another round of crisis management, Meghan herself was not finished. She had one last move, one last desperate play for control, truth, or narrative redemption. And as the monarchy prepared to go public, Meghan made one last desperate move, one that backfired catastrophically and exposed her on a global stage, faced with mounting pressure and international speculation. Meghan agreed to a televised interview meant to clear her name. But as the cameras rolled, her carefully constructed defences began to crack. What was meant to be a redemption arc turned into a televised implosion of trust, legacy, and identity. It was supposed to be her moment of reclamation. A chance to silence the storm with grace, to reclaim the narrative that had slipped through her fingers one headline at a time. The network had promised a global audience, the interviewer was carefully selected, and the tone was set. Soft lighting, compassionate framing, and a sympathetic opening. Meghan entered with determination in her voice, offering a mixture of wounded dignity and unwavering certainty. She denied everything, every accusation, every implication, every piece of damning speculation that had wrapped around her name like a crown of thorns. Her voice trembled only when she spoke of the emotional toll, painting herself as the victim of a calculated smear campaign rooted in fear, not fact. And for a moment, it worked. The audience leaned in, the internet softened. But then came the rupture. Unbeknownst to the network, a Palace aide once fiercely loyal, now quietly disillusioned, leaked the DNA report minutes before the interview aired. What had been contained within boardrooms and private vaults was suddenly online. Screens lit up across newsrooms, journalists scrambled, and before the broadcast had even reached its halfway point, the truth had spread faster than the interview itself. The document was real, the details were stark, the royal lineage claims were unfounded, and the timing devastating. The moment the interviewer asked about the authenticity of Meghan's ancestral ties, the pressure reached its breaking point. She stumbled. Her eyes narrowed, her voice wavered, not with fear but with frustration. Denials turned defensive, empathy gave way to tension. And as the interviewer pushed gently, referencing new information surfacing, Meghan's tone shifted. What followed was a spontaneous unraveling, an emotional torrent of accusations, sorrow, and veiled threats. She spoke of betrayal, of being isolated, of truth being a construct wielded by power. She claimed the monarchy had always feared her history because it was a mirror they couldn't control. But by then the damage was done. Public opinion flipped in real time. Hashtags turned. Former allies distanced themselves. Media outlets that once shielded her began airing segments dissecting the inconsistencies she had once called legacy. What had started as a moment of self-defense ended in self-destruction. The final minutes of the interview saw Meghan offering a chilling combination of anger and pain, stating, "They can erase my name from their records, but they will never erase what I made them feel." Her last words lingered like smoke, defiant but broken. But the monarchy had one final card to play, an act of erasure so brutal, so symbolic, it rewrote her place in royal history forever. In the ultimate act of rejection, the palace announced that Meghan Markle would be removed from all official royal records, portraits, and future exhibitions. Her legacy, once poised to redefine the monarchy, was now classified, archived, and sealed under a new royal directive. This wasn't just erasure, it was exile. The decision came swiftly, with little ceremony and no room for negotiation. A royal decree, signed by the reigning sovereign and countersigned by the Lord Chamberlain, ordered the immediate retraction of Meghan's presence from all current and future royal publications. It was not phrased as punishment, it was positioned as a historical correction. But within the walls of the institution, everyone knew the truth. This was a scorched earth response, a cleansing of a chapter the crown now deemed illegitimate. Her portrait, once scheduled to appear in the National Gallery's upcoming exhibit on modern faces of the monarchy, was pulled hours before printing. The frame had already been selected, the lighting adjusted, but in a single email it was over. Behind the scenes it was Camilla, Anne, and William who led the final internal discussions. Each carried different wounds from the saga. Camilla, having endured the subtle undermining of her own standing. Anne, having fought like a sentinel to preserve the historical integrity of the royal line. And William, who had once tried to handle the matter quietly, now resolute in his duty to protect the monarchy's foundation, even if it meant slicing through blood ties. Their agreement was unanimous. The monarchy could survive scandal, but not a falsified legacy embedded within its lineage. Changes appeared almost instantly. The royal website, meticulously maintained by palace staff, was updated in real time. Pages referencing Meghan were revised, her titles struck through, and in some cases, entire sections were removed altogether. Archived announcements were redacted. Succession documents were reissued with her name omitted entirely. It was as if she had never existed within the royal framework. But the final act, the one that solidified this purge as something far deeper than protocol, was conducted privately at Windsor. In a room few are ever permitted to enter, her personal royal crest, once approved and ceremoniously unveiled, was brought forth, placed on a small wooden stand, and quietly burned. The flames didn't just consume a symbol, they erased a claim. There was no official statement issued about the burning, no images leaked. But whispers travelled fast among staff. It was Anne's idea, a symbolic gesture echoing a past only a few still remembered when Edward VIII's letters were scorched to sever his influence. Meghan's crest joined those ashes, not as punishment, as finality. But even as Meghan fades on the palace walls, her story lingers, whispers of betrayal, identity and ambition that will haunt the House of Windsor for decades to come. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.